I'll tell you what it actually means to pass a background check. Parents hear this person is safe with children. What it actually means is you gave your correct name, your date of birth, your social security number, and your address. It means the information that you say on those topics is what is documentable. It means you're not on the terrorist watch list. It means you have not been convicted of a crime in the last 7 years. Does not mean you haven't committed a crime. It means you haven't been convicted of one. And it means you're not on the sex offender website. That's all a background check means. So if schools or churches or other places were honest, what they would be saying to parents is, we checked that this person is using their correct name, that they're not a terrorist, and that they haven't committed a crime for 7 years, and that they're not part of the 1% of abusers who have been caught. That's all it means. So why doesn't the church use background checks? Well, they're remarkably poor at finding people. Now, the comment here that you might be making in your own head and that I too have made is, yeah, but isn't catching even one better than catching none? I'd say, sure, absolutely. And sometimes you hear about it, right? Such and such person applied for this volunteer job to work with kids, and they were found to be on the sex abuser list. For that reason, and for that reason alone, I actually think background checks are a great idea. However, here's where I think they're a terrible idea. What's the likelihood that a person who is actively committing child abuse right now is on any of those lists? It's so small that when we say to parents, this person is safe, we actually have no idea if that's true or not. Second claim that they make, the church refuses to do background checks, and that's because they don't care about protecting children. They would rather save themselves the embarrassment or save the cost of doing them or save the administrative hassle of doing them. And that is why the church is proven to care about abusers more than children. It's a really scandalous claim to most people's ears. That would be like, what? Why? The church refuses to do them. The language there is funny, right? Because refuses means, or at least it implies some version of, they know this would be a great idea and they don't do it. So I think a fair question to ask is, what actually is a background check, and do they help? If we implemented worldwide background checks for the church, would kids be any safer? People hear background check and they're like, yeah, I definitely want those. So let's kind of ask some questions. First, what is a background check? I asked this question to a group of about 75 parents. And so what do you think is checked in a background check? What are we actually looking at? And I got this wide variety of answers. Everything from, well, they just look them up in the sex abuser database, to they interview people from their past. They interview their employer. They check their credit. They go through their computer history. All kinds of things that have nothing to do with what actually happens in a background check. When you say to a parent, if you're a church or a school, and you say to a parent, this adult has passed a background check, what that parent hears is, somehow some process has happened that proves this person is safe to be around my child. It doesn't actually prove that, though. Here's the three factors that play into why I say that. The background checks do not prove what they say that they are proving. At best, we should be saying nothing has come up on their background check. That would be a more honest way to say it. Here's the three reasons. Number one, we call it delayed disclosure. Victims of sexual abuse do not generally talk about it. And when they do, it's years after the fact. Most states in the United States, it's changing. Many states are updating their laws, but most states have a statute of limitations. It goes anywhere from 1 year to maybe 7 or 11 years. Meaning, if the crime is not reported, either a year or whatever the amount the state has, if crime is not reported in that amount of time, it's not allowed to be reported. Nothing is going to happen. The person essentially gets away with it. The The reality is victims wait far longer on average to report than most statute of limitations allow for. They just do. It's an ineffective system that actually does protect predators. If you abuse a child at 7, they don't give that child like just until 8 in a 1-year state. They say at the age that the child should have reasonably known what they should do with that information. So even at 18, you're asking then a 19-year-old to kind of have the presence of mind and the maturity and the composure to be able to go report something like that. And most just don't. So if reporting is delayed, and by the time the person reports, the statute has passed, even if the abuse actually happened, it will not get on any background check. It is as if it didn't happen. It doesn't mean that it didn't happen. It doesn't mean that this person is safe. It means it will not be in any record that you can find anywhere. And the laws in most states still are currently set up so that this is what happens the majority of the time. So you do a background check. What that means is this person was not caught within the time frame that the state they were living in at the time determined was a reasonable amount of time for that victim to report, which is really, really different than this person is safe to be with kids. Second reason why background checks just get super, super complicated is there are almost no convictions for sexual abuse. You've heard about plenty, right? You hear about them in the news. Probably some like important big ones might even come to mind for you if you follow this topic at all. But most of the time, it doesn't get to the court system. Most of the time, number one, it doesn't get reported to the police in time. If it does, it gets reported, and there just is not enough evidence for them to turn it into a case. Abusers abuse in secret. The ones who get caught frequently are the ones who made some kind of physical evidence of what happened. But most of the time, that is not how it is working because they don't want to get caught, and there just is not enough evidence to even charge them, never mind convict them. Of those who are charged, most of the time, most victims are going to be willing to take a settlement because they don't want to go to court over it. They don't want to sit in front of an entire courtroom and explain the very worst things that have ever happened in their lives to a whole bunch of strangers. So frequent settlements outside of court are just standard. The cases that go all the way through to trial are actually really, really quite rare. And if there's a settlement, maybe that settlement has been made public, but probably not. Nothing to find on their background check. How are you ever going to know that even happened? You won't. It's a very different thing to say, this person gave the victim a financial settlement to keep it out of the courts. That's very different than saying this person is safe with kids. But either way, they would have a so-called clean background check. Parents would give a person like that their trust. And that's really my main problem with background checks, is they give a false positive. They tell parents, we are positive you can trust this person. He is safe to be around your kids. And it actually doesn't mean anything like that. It means they have not been caught, and most of the time they're not caught. That's what background checks mean. Back to just delayed disclosure a tiny bit. There's a group called Child USA, and they're sort of the think tank for this statute of limitation reform. You can go on their website. It's childusa.org, and they have all the most up-to-date information on every state in the United States, what their statute of limitations is, are there laws in front of their state legislature to change that, kind of the whole history of that. So their research says the average age that an adult will report about their child's sexual abuse, the average is 52. 52 years old before people start talking about it. And the statute of limitations has long since passed. And in some cases, the abuser would certainly be dead by then. It's not an easy topic for victims to talk about. And so they wait and wait and wait. So with an average of 52 years old, abuse that happened 40 years ago so say in the 1980s, would just now, here in 2025, be even begun to be talked about. Abuse that's happening today might not get even spoken about by a victim for another 40 years. So if you saw a so-called clean background check, you have no way of knowing, is this abuse that's happening right now and we're just not going to know about it for 40 years? Or is this person actually safe? Background checks are not one of what they're purported to be. One of the questions that comes up around this is like, okay, if people wait so long to report, what's going on here? Why is that? When do people actually kind of have the greatest likelihood of reporting? And what happens is about a third of abuse cases are discovered in childhood. And the very, very big majority of time, they are not discovered because a child goes to an adult and says, oh, I would like to inform you of this thing that is happening to me. And then they very articulately spill out the contents of what has been happening to them. No. What happens is a kid will say something kind of weird. And an adult who is around them will pick up on it. Be like, well, what? Well, that's weird. How would you know that piece of information? Or why would your relative be in this situation with you? The cases that get caught in childhood, that is normally how an adult first figures out what happens. Sometimes we adults, we forget that in childhood, they don't communicate the same way that we do. If I had a piece of information that I wanted to share with you and it was really important, I might say, hey, could we set up a meeting? Like, I want to talk to you about something, and I would know what I wanted to say. And it would be this sort of more formalized exchange of information, even if it was, hey, I need to tell you something. And we were talking over text, right? I would know, and you would know I had something I wanted to say to you. It's really, really unlikely that a child comes to any adult and says, I would like to make an appointment with you to discuss the sexual abuse that is happening to me. Kids don't do that. Most adults that I've ever talked to, and probably including you, have this very, very deep feeling that says, if I ever found out a kid I know was being abused, I would move heaven and earth to protect that child. And I believe people when they say that. However, what they mean, I think, most of the time is if I had very clear evidence, if the child told me directly, if I knew the child was saying this thing, I would act. The first pieces of information that come out from kids do not come out like that. They come out as mistakes. They come out as kids saying things that they don't really quite realize they're saying. It comes out as them having pieces of information that they are far too young to have, and that an adult who hears them is brave enough to move the conversation forward and ask the kid about what they're saying, or observe, or do all kinds of things to figure out what's actually going on with this kid. Parents, I know one of the questions that comes in your mind right here is like, well, how in the world am I supposed to know if something is happening to my kid? Part of it is you listen for weird pieces of information, and then you have to be brave enough to ask some follow-up questions, knowing the kid might have just said something weird and it actually has nothing to do with abuse. The kid might have heard something at school and they're repeating that, right? It might not automatically equal this kid is being abused. But where adults drop the ball on not being able to detect child abuse is right there in that conversation. When a kid first leaks out some unexpected information, and adults let it go without picking it up. So 30% of abuse cases are found out about in childhood in this means. During someone's late teens, 18, all the way up to 30, it's the lowest rate of reporting of a person's entire life. Less than 5% of abuse cases are reported during this era. I think the number has probably switched a tiny bit since the Me Too era. This research is from 2018. So it's probably switched a bit, but I don't honestly expect by much. Psychologically, a lot of people in their 20s are just trying to move on with their lives and forget what happened. And get to some happy place in life and they've got a lot of momentum. Maybe they're going to school, maybe they're getting married, they're putting their head down and trying to move their life forward. They don't want to talk about abuse in their 20s. Between 30 and 50, about 10 to 12% of abuse cases come out. So it certainly is double what it was in someone's 20s. Often these are the people who they went through abuse in childhood. They tried to push it down during their 20s. They really, really tried to push away all the thoughts and feelings. And by the time they get to 40-ish, 30, 40 years old, they just can't push it down anymore. They end up in someone's office like mine. I'm a mental health therapist, and start talking about their abuse. But even by then, statute of limitations is very likely to have long ago run out. It's actually between ages 50 and 70 that adults usually disclose their abuse. 40% of abuse cases are disclosed during that era. It's actually greater than the number that are found in childhood. And you remember the ones found in childhood are usually found by accident. They're found because an adult picks up on a weird thing that a kid said. By 50 to 70 years old, if you are in a state that has a statute of limitations, it most certainly has expired. So again, what is going to show up on a background? Nothing. There are some changes to statute of limitations. State of California recently changed theirs to be 40 years old. So if you are 40 years old and under and abuse happened to you in childhood, you can report it and it's still a reportable crime. But the average is still 52. So they're still more than a decade under the average of when people are talking about this. There is some variation on the type of abuse and the type of crime. There's a little wiggle room in some states, and some states are better than others, and some states are changing. There's no age cap for abuse in a handful of states: Colorado, Illinois, Maine, Maryland, Vermont, New Hampshire. Way to go, East Coast. There's no age cap at all for those. The worst ones are, Georgia, Idaho, Indiana, New Mexico, Ohio, Washington State. They sort of have the most restrictive rules. If you're interested in this topic at all, I highly recommend go to the Child USA website. They have a really, really detailed breakdown of all of this. So even if we didn't have this delay in kind of a reporting gap, there's still this problem of what is actually being checked. As we were saying before, very, very little is actually checked. Most of the time what it means, like what is being checked means, they check the official sex offender website for potentially the state and federal level for this person. The likelihood that an abuser is on the sex offender website is extremely low. Those are only the people who have made it all the way through the court process. And as we said before, most people are never even charged. This is roughly 1% is the estimate of abusers are on the sex offender website. So if that's your standard for a background check, you're checking an incredibly tiny subset of the bigger whole. Background checks often do an address history. They find out where this person has lived, and they try to do checks in the other states where they may have lived, which is great, except for you still run into the same problem. If they weren't accused and convicted, they're still not going to show up on the sex offender website of that state. All states share this problem. Many background checks will look at a person's wider criminal history. They're not just looking for abuse. They're not just looking on the sex offender website. They're looking for any crimes this person has been convicted of. However, it's only going back 7 years. So a person could be 50, and we're only looking at crimes they've committed since they were 43, meaning they had a lot of adult years to commit some crimes that won't be looked at. Also, background checks can do a check on alias names that they're using, a few other things to help them know more places to look, more states or more names under which to look. But what they're looking at is still a database of convictions, which almost no one is convicted. So you're starting to see the problem with background checks. I'll tell you what it actually means to pass a background check. Parents hear this person is safe with children. What it actually means is you gave your correct name, your date of birth, your social security number, and your address. It means the information that you say on those topics is what is documentable. It means you're not on the terrorist watch list. It means you have not been convicted of a crime in the last 7 years. Does not mean you haven't committed a crime. It means you haven't been convicted of one. And it means you're not on the sex offender website. That's all a background check means. So if schools or churches or other places were honest, what they would be saying to parents is, we checked that this person is using their correct name, that they're not a terrorist, and that they haven't committed a crime for 7 years, and that they're not part of the 1% of abusers who have been caught. That's all it means. So why doesn't the church use background checks? Well, they're remarkably poor at finding people. Now, the comment here that you might be making in your own head and that I too have made is, yeah, but isn't catching even one better than catching none? I'd say, sure, absolutely. And sometimes you hear about it, right? Such and such person applied for this volunteer job to work with kids, and they were found to be on the sex abuser list. For that reason, and for that reason alone, I actually think background checks are a great idea. However, here's where I think they're a terrible idea. What's the likelihood that a person who is actively committing child abuse right now is on any of those lists? It's so small that when we say to parents, this person is safe, we actually have no idea if that's true or not. It's giving false hope to parents. And here's what abusers do. Abusers don't just grab a kid and take him into the bushes, right? And then that's that. Abusers gain the trust of families. Abusers gain the trust of parents. Sometimes we say abusers don't just groom a kid, they groom an entire community. And they make the adults around this kid feel safe with them. And I don't know about you, but I feel really, really ambivalent and even kind of scared of the church saying to a parent, this guy's clear background check, you can trust him, when the abuser might actually be using that process against the child that they want to abuse. Because it's a document that shows the parents, see, I'm okay. And the parents believe it. So I have no official information or notice from the church that this is their logic on why background checks are not widely used. But it certainly is my logic. I will say background checks are being used in states where it's required. I know it's required in California. I know they're being used in the UK. I actually think that is probably where things are going. I think most states are going to require any kind of volunteer who works with kids anywhere is going to need to have a background check, and the church will have to submit to those laws. And I hope that there's enough ruckus raised to be able to say a background check is not what you think it is. Don't use this document to let yourself build trust in somebody who might be setting off alarm bells in other ways. Last bit about background checks, and it's back to this Bisbee, Arizona case. The man in this case, he commits really, really the most horrific abuse that you have ever heard of. Here's what's weird. Dude was a federal employee. He was a Border Patrol agent. He had to pass a federal level background check every single year, and he passed them. Why did he pass them? Because a background check can't find what isn't on record. And there had been no convictions on him. Meanwhile, he is at home abusing one and then later two of his daughters. Meanwhile, at work, he's passing background checks with flying colors. In fact, that man would have passed a background check until the day he hung himself in prison because there was no conviction yet. And he's one of the most dangerous child abusers that I have known about. So if the church had run a background check on him, he was not a volunteer with children at the church. He actually barely came to church. But if he had, and the church had run a background check on him, then it would be the church colluding with that, saying, oh yeah, this guy's clear background check, good to go. When he wasn't remotely clear. He was an absolute monster. So if the claim that this podcast makes and is made in lots of other places, the claim is if the church really wanted to keep kids safe, they would do background checks, and the fact that they don't proves they don't care about kids. There just isn't any evidence to support that. In the places where background checks are not required, absolutely, parents still must be vigilant about who they're allowing to have access to their children. Wards should still be vigilant about who they're allowing access to children. In the places where they are required, we really, really should be changing our language around it. Instead of saying this guy has a clean background check, the phrase should be something like, nothing was found on his record, with maybe some education to parents of that don't mean a thing. So yeah, background checks are not required. And even though they might be in the future, they don't do that much good. And parents and people generally, I think, don't understand that.